right, you're still watching QTV, and we do have a special feature of the United States of America ambassador to Zambia, who is Mr. Michael Gonzales, ahead of the Anti-Corruption Day, which falls on the 9th of December every year. And of course, the African Anti-Corruption Day 2022 theme is strategies and mechanisms for the transparent management of COVID-19 funds. Welcome to Zambia once again.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, Rhoda.
It's good to have you.
Thanks.
All right. So how's your stay so far?
It's been fantastic. The Zambian people have been so warm and welcoming. I've had a chance to get around Lusaka, but more importantly, get out of Lusaka as well.
Okay.
Lower Zambezi up to the Copper Belt, but there's still a lot to see.
Yeah. And the food?
Fantastic.
Okay.
I'm still working on my technique, but no, I'm enjoying it.
All right. Is this your first time working in Africa and particularly Zambia?
No, in fact, almost all of my career has been focused on Africa. I first came to Africa and Zambia 27 years ago as a 20-year-old researcher. And over the 27 years since then, more than half of my time has been living on the continent, plus another several years focused on the continent.
Yeah. All right. Now, speaking of, corruption, and the theme being strategies and mechanisms for the transparent management of COVID-19 funds, how would you interpret this theme?
So I think the theme of corruption writ large is critically important basically in every country, certainly in Zambia, certainly in my country and every other country I've served in over my career. Recently, we've had a massive injection of funding around the world to respond to this unexpected deadly pandemic. And when you have a huge outflows of expenditure like that, there's often plenty of opportunities for corruption. But I think the remedies for that are the same as the remedies for corruption writ large. It's transparency in procurements, it's accountability when there are allegations against individuals for corrupt practices, that they be investigated quickly and that there be people held accountable if there are corrupt actions.
Yeah. And also, still on corruption, as a country, how have we performed so far in terms of fighting corruption and also commitment to just ending corruption?
Look, I think since the New Dawn government has come into place 16 months ago, the verbal commitment during the campaign has been very, very strong, focusing on fighting corruption. There have been some notable actions that we salute and really appreciate. Certain deals have been canceled if they looked like they were particularly problematic. There's been an uptick in investigations and arrests by the accountability organizations, particularly the Anti-Corruption Commission. There's been, to a degree, an opening of space for the media and civil society to inquire about these kinds of allegations. And so I think there's been notable progress. But ultimately, there still needs to be a huge amount of institutionalized reforms to both prevent corruption from going forward into the future and to hold accountable corruption that has already happened.
Yeah. And do you think that, from as we are moving like this with the New Dawn government and the way that, they've put a lot of things in place to fight corruption, we are, seeing a bright future for our country?
I think the potential for a very bright future is absolutely there. The challenge is turning that potential into a reality. And, we saw in the United States when Barack Obama was elected, there were huge expectations of what he can do, much like what we see with President Hichilema. Massive expectations. Early reforms can be done by the boss using a strike of a pen to change things very, very quickly. And I think we've seen some of that in those improvements that I've made reference to. The deeper institutional reforms, however, are a lot more difficult. They require a lot more buy-in, a lot more exhibition of political will, and that's where we are now. So now, how do we as the international community, but more importantly, the Zambian people, maintain that pressure and that support to the government to institutionalize those reforms?
And what would you say are some of the effects of corruption on the growth of our economy?
I think we feel it every single day, whether you go into a clinic where the United States or others have given free medications for certain treatments, and they're not available because there was fraud in the corruption process, or they were bought at a rock bottom price, although paid at this price because they're already expired. People die. If there's a bad road that's constructed at a massively inflated price, but ultimately it's unsafe for passengers, again, we're seeing it in terms of lives and livelihoods. And we've seen massive large infrastructure projects that have been tendered at hugely inflated prices that ultimately the Zambian people are going to be paying the mortgages on for a generation. I look particularly at the first tendering of this Lusaka to Ndola dual carriageway project, a project that should have cost $450 to $500 million that was tendered to China Jiangxi construction company for $1.24 billion, more than almost 3 times the price of what it should have cost. And had that deal not been canceled, the Zambian people, your kids, would be paying that off for a generation having received only a third of what you should have.
Wow.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So Zambia's public debt right now is $27 billion. Now that's domestic and international debt. If you look at that per person, per Zambian, woman, man, child, 22,000 kwacha. Do you have an extra 22,000 that you can spend on debt? Especially if that debt, a lot of that went to things that you didn't actually get value for. This is how corruption affects Zambians.
And how is the USA helping in the fight against corruption?
So a couple of ways. If we look at tax administration, we're working with the Zambian Revenue Authority on improving tax regulations, tax policy, tax implementation to make sure that the government is receiving the revenues from taxpayers that they should to pay for services for the Zambian people. We're working with the Ministry of Finance and local governments as well on what they do with those revenues and how they expend them. So transparency and processes for public procurements, but also audits and transparency in the government budgeting process. And then we're working very closely with the accountability institutions like the Anti-Corruption Commission, the Financial Intelligence Center, et cetera, to improve capacity for investigations and prosecutions. That's what we're doing. But ultimately, we are not driving this campaign. This is a campaign that the Zambian government has committed to during the campaign period. And this is an effort that the Zambian people clearly have demonstrated a commitment to wanting to see move forward. And so the Zambian people, the Zambian government are leading the charge against corruption. The United States is playing a supporting role.
Yeah. And as we commemorate this very important day, give us your views on the state of corruption generally and also specifically how it affects countries and the people, especially in Africa.
Look, I think the reason we have an International Day Against Corruption is because it's an international problem that affects all of us. We've seen just in recent years, even in my own country, a governor selling deliberations on who he should appoint as a senator to the United States Senate. We've seen ample other examples of businesses trying to pay off public officials. It happens in the United States and Zambia, all around the world. And I've talked about the types of impacts. So the question is, how do we use this day as a marker to recommit to our efforts to combat? And so, for example, in Zambia, how is Zambia going to not just deal with past corruption, but stop it from going forward? I would argue a couple of key components. Transparency in how government operates, particularly in public procurements, is really important. So you can see the public, the media and civil society can see if you're paying $190 million for a presidential jet that cost $40 or $50 million. Where did that extra money go to? If you're paying $1.24 billion for a road that should only have cost $500 million. So the transparency in public procurements, the terms of those procurements really allows for people, government watchdogs, if you will, or oversight agencies to recognize if there's a problem. I think you, the media and civil society, the public, play a really important role as well in scrutinizing that data as it becomes more available to ask those questions. Does this make sense? And to put pressure on government. And the third component really has to be accountability, because frankly, right now, corruption pays.
Yeah.
And we need to change that calculus so that the cost and the risk of being involved in corrupt practices is too high. People need to lose their jobs. They need to lose their ill-gotten assets. They need to lose their freedom by being incarcerated. You do that, and all of a sudden people will say, maybe I don't need that markup because the costs are too high. And the Zambian people play a key role in demanding those kinds of reforms.
Absolutely. Now, there is obviously grand corruption and there is everyday corruption. Can you kindly tell us how you determine the difference and the cumulative effect on the way society behaves?
Sure. I think, when you talk about what is going to make the growth trajectory of a country go from a steep growth pattern to mediocrity, is going to be the grand corruption. It's going to be the deals that spend an extra $150 million that is unnecessary. But what affects the average Zambian? It's when they're stopped every 15 kilometers by another police checkpoint for lunch money. It's when they can't get their driver's license unless they pay a little bit extra, unless it's when they go to get a license for starting a business and the delays continue until someone pays. So those absolutely affect just the day-to-day doing business and living experience of the average Zambian. I would argue you put the Inspector General of Police in an unmarked civilian vehicle in clothes like we wear every day, and you have him take a road trip with a camera crew behind him. Someone stops him for lunch money, and there's an arrest. You do that once a day for a week. You put it on camera. QFM broadcasts it. Yeah. Pretty soon, there's going to be a lot less requests for lunch money. Those are the types of really tangible efforts to fight the everyday corruption that I think can also take place. They can take place now with the legislation and the resources currently available, and they'll make a huge impact on people's lives.
Yeah, definitely. And what changes would you like to see that would give you the confidence that Zambia is in the right track to fight corruption?
Well, again, I think it's really for the Zambian people to determine what they would like to see. I would argue if we look at international best practices, some of the reforms that we've seen successful are those things that I talked about earlier. It's the transparency in public procurement processes. It's the availability of data about debt. It's empowering civil society and the media, having access to information law that works and is on the books, but also asset disclosures by public officials. Right now, cabinet officials and parliamentarians are supposed to declare their assets. Most of them don't. There's no accountability that I've seen yet. In the United States, for example, any public official in a procurement role and all senior public officials, including me, the U.S. ambassador, every year we submit our asset disclosures. And they don't just go into a black box. They're publicly available. And just a month ago, I got a note that the State Department has given mine and thousands of other asset disclosures of public officials to a media house who requested it. And that's exactly what I'm talking about in terms of public accountability. And so if they find that there's some kind of assets that I have that are out of track with my income stream, then there's an opportunity for inquiry. We're not seeing that in Zambia. And as a result, we're seeing all of these allegations of public officials with 49 houses or so many other what look like ill-gotten gains. These are mechanisms that can be put into place fairly easily. So the Zambian people, I would argue, should be calling for greater asset disclosures, greater transparency.
Yeah. Are there any sectors in particular that you feel there is need for transparency?
So I would argue, again, particularly in public procurement. And where's the big money expenditures? Foreign ministry doesn't spend a whole lot of money. They may rent a house for a diplomat. The Ministry of Health just got approved a budget of 16 billion kwacha. The Ministry of Education's budget allocation for this year, 20 billion kwacha. Why? Because they need that. We're hiring, 30,000 additional teachers, 11,000 additional health workers. We need that increase in budget. But where the money is also where the opportunity to take the money is. And so I would argue those areas, particularly health, education, sometimes defense, are where the greater transparency is really vital.
And I personally do believe that as the Zambian people, we have a huge role to play when it comes to fighting corruption. Maybe as we get to wind up, what would be your message to the Zambian people out there, and concerning corruption?
Yeah, I think so often we see corruption as affecting us day in and day out, whether it's the lunch money stops or the indebtedness of our grandchildren. And we feel that there's nothing that we can do. And I would argue that the opposite is the case. Elected leaders are there because we voted for them. We put them in those positions. And so the Zambian people, the electorate, should be calling on their parliamentarians, their local councillors, their local elected officials, and demanding these kinds of reforms. What have you done on greater transparency? What have you done to pass that access to information legislation or the asset disclosure legislation? There are hotlines for the ACC that should be used absolutely as well. And ultimately, I think the voice of the people is powerful. And so, for example, if there are credible allegations, as there are this week alone, against a transaction involving AVIC Corporation and providing a $320 million housing project for the Ministry of Home Affairs, that boils down to $137,000 per house, 2.2 million kwacha per house. Does that sound about right? And if not, it sounds like there's grounds for an inquiry at the minimum. At the same time, we've seen in the past couple of weeks reports that the government is considering giving a massive tender to that same AVIC Corporation. Maybe that should be put on hold while inquiries are pursued. And those are the kinds of things that the public should be calling for. And the media plays a critical role in informing the public in that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for featuring on our program today, and thank you so much for coming through.
Rhoda, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right. I have been talking to United States of America Ambassador to Zambia, who is Mr. Michael Gonzales, ahead of the Anti-Corruption Day that falls on the 9th of December. And of course, the theme is strategies and mechanisms for the transparent management of COVID-19 funds. Have a good day.